From the outside, you'd never guess that the woman in faded jeans and a simple black turtleneck was worth billions. She walked through Silicon Valley's bustling streets just like anyone else, stopping for her morning coffee at the local cafe where she'd been a regular for the past decade. The baristas knew her as Jay, just another friendly face in the tech crowd. But behind that understated appearance was one of the most brilliant minds in cybersecurity. 10 years ago, she'd started her company in a tiny apartment, coding late into the night while working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Her breakthrough came when she developed an AI security system that could predict and prevent cyber attacks before they happened, something the big tech companies said was impossible. She remembered those early days vividly, pitching her idea to rooms full of investors who would look right through her, telling her that someone like her might be better off with a simpler business. Some even suggested she hire a white male friend to pitch in her place. She'd smile politely, thank them for their time, and move on to the next meeting. The rejection letters piled up, but she kept refining her code, improving her system, and building her network. Then came the day when a major bank's security was breached, losing millions in customer data. Her system, running in BIA, had flagged the exact vulnerability weeks before. That caught everyone's attention. Within months, her company went from a one-woman operation to a team of 20. By the end of the year, she had offices in 3 countries. Now, her security software protected everything from small businesses to government agencies. Forbes had featured her in their 30 under 30 list, calling her the future of cybersecurity. But success hadn't changed her core values. She still mentored young girls in coding, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds. Her company's internship program specifically sought out talented students from community colleges and public schools. Talent doesn't come with a zip code, she'd often say at conferences. She stayed out of the spotlight mostly, preferring to let her work speak for itself. The tech world knew her as the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms in history. But to her small circle of friends, she was still the same passionate coder who believed technology could make the world a little fairer. That morning, as she packed her laptop for a tech conference in New York, she had no idea that her commitment to making things fairer was about to be tested in a very personal way. She booked a first-class ticket, not because she enjoyed luxury, but because she needed the quiet time to prepare her keynote speech. Little did she know, this routine flight would spark a chain of events that would change not just her life, but an entire industry. The morning started like any other at JFK Airport. She arrived early, laptop bag slung over her shoulder, dressed in her usual comfortable style, dark jeans and a cozy sweater. The first-class lounge was quiet, just how she liked it. She needed to polish her keynote speech about making tech more inclusive, a topic that always brought butterflies to her stomach, no matter how many times she'd given similar talks. Boarding began right on time. As she made her way to her first-class seat, she noticed the slight double takes from some passengers and crew members. She was used to it by now. Being one of the few black women in spaces like this still raised eyebrows, even in 2024. She just smiled politely and found her seat, 2A, right by the window. The first sign that something was off came when the flight attendant breezed past her 3 times without acknowledging her drink request, while fawning over other first-class passengers. Maybe she's just busy, she thought, giving the benefit of the doubt as she always did. She pulled out her laptop, trying to focus on her presentation. "Excuse me," she said softly when the flight attendant passed by again. "Could I get some water, please?" The flight attendant's response was a curt, "I'll get to you when I can," before turning to the businessman across the aisle with a bright smile. "Sir, would you like a refill of your champagne?" The contrast in treatment became impossible to ignore. When dinner service began, she was repeatedly skipped over. When she pressed her call button, it went unanswered. Other passengers were starting to notice too. An elderly woman across the aisle gave her a sympathetic look. Things took a turn when she stood up to get something from her overhead bag. The same flight attendant rushed over, saying loudly, "First-class passengers must remain seated during service." She calmly showed her ticket, explaining she was indeed a first-class passenger, just like everyone else. That's when the flight attendant's tone became hostile. "I find it hard to believe you paid for this seat. We've had problems with upgrades before." The words hung in the air, their implication clear to everyone within earshot. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The pilot, who had come out to use the restroom, approached to see what the commotion was about. Instead of diffusing the situation, he made it worse. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, directing his question to the flight attendant, not to her. She maintained her composure, years of boardroom experience kicking in. "There seems to be some confusion about my ticket," she explained calmly, pulling up her boarding pass on her phone. "I'm simply trying to access my bag, just like any other passenger." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Other passengers had stopped eating. Some were discreetly recording with their phones. The pilot's face hardened as he glanced at her ticket, then back at her casual attire. "Ma'am, if you can't conduct yourself appropriately in first class, we'll have to move you." She knew this moment, the moment when you have to choose between speaking up and staying quiet. She'd faced it in countless meetings, pitches, and conferences. But this time was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phone cameras, shared thousands of times, and ultimately lead to the kind of change she'd been advocating for her entire career. But not in the way anyone expected. "I have every right to be here," she said quietly but firmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The cabin had gone completely silent. She could feel everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Several phones were recording now, their cameras capturing every moment. "I'd like to speak to someone from customer service when we land," she continued, trying to de-escalate the situation. Instead of calming things down, her reasonable request seemed to anger the flight attendant even more. "Oh, you'll be speaking to someone all right," the flight attendant snapped, stepping closer. "You people always think you can make demands." The words hit hard, their meaning crystal clear to everyone listening. A few gasps came from nearby passengers. The pilot, instead of maintaining professionalism, joined in. "Listen here," he said, pointing his finger just inches from her face. "We can divert this flight if you keep causing trouble." His words were loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. She took a deep breath, remembering all the times she'd handled hostile boardroom situations. "I'm not causing any trouble," she replied calmly. "I'm a paying passenger requesting basic service just like everyone else." That's when things went from bad to worse. As she reached for her phone to document what was happening, the flight attendant suddenly grabbed her wrist. No recordings allowed. The grip was tight, meant to intimidate. "Please let go of me," she said firmly, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. Instead of complying, the flight attendant pushed her backward. She stumbled, catching herself against the seat. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The flight attendant, apparently frustrated by her continued composure, raised her hand and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The pilot, instead of intervening to stop the assault, grabbed her shoulder roughly and tried to force her into her seat. "Sit down and be quiet," he ordered, his face red with anger. Several passengers jumped up in protest. A young woman in row 3 shouted, "Stop it. Leave her alone." An older gentleman in a business suit stood up, saying, "This is completely unacceptable." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight back. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started recording. "I'd want everyone to note the time and flight number," she said clearly, her cheek still stinging. "And I'd appreciate if any witnesses would share their contact information with me after we land." The calm in her voice seemed to finally penetrate the fog of anger around the crew members. They stepped back, suddenly aware of the dozens of phones recording their behavior. The flight attendant's face paled as she realized what she'd done. A kind-looking woman from across the aisle handed her a business card. "I saw everything," she whispered. "I'll be happy to make a statement." Others nodded in agreement, some already writing down their information. For the rest of the flight, no one served her section. The flight attendant and pilot stayed in their respective areas, probably realizing the gravity of their actions. She used the time to document everything while it was fresh in her mind, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. Little did the crew know that their worst mistake wasn't the physical assault, it was assuming she was powerless. As the plane descended toward its destination, she was already formulating a plan that would transform this ugly incident into lasting change. Everyone expected her to file a lawsuit. Everyone expected her to make a public scene. Everyone expected predictable outrage and demands for justice. But she had something much more impactful in mind. Something that would change not just one flight crew's behavior, but an entire industry's culture. As the plane touched down, no one rushed to get up. The usual scramble for overhead bags was replaced by a tense quiet. Passengers kept glancing between her and the crew, many still holding their phones, having captured everything. She sat calmly in her seat, gathering her belongings with practiced ease. Her cheek no longer stung, but she could feel it was slightly swollen. Opening her compact mirror, she carefully photographed the red mark that was beginning to show. "Here's my card," whispered a businessman 2 rows behind her. "I travel this route every week, and I've never seen anything like this." 3 more passengers quietly passed her their contact information. One showed her the video she'd recorded, making sure it had captured everything clearly. The pilot stayed locked in the cockpit. The flight attendant who had struck her was nowhere to be seen. Another crew member, who hadn't been involved, made nervous announcements about deplaning procedures, her voice shaking slightly. As she stood to leave, a young girl, maybe 12 or 13, touched her arm. "You were so brave," the girl said softly. "My mom says we should always stand up for what's right, but it's hard sometimes." She smiled at the young girl, remembering her own childhood dreams of changing the world. Police officers were waiting at the gate. The airline had called them, probably expecting her to be the problem. But as passenger after passenger came forward with videos and statements, the officers' attention quickly turned to the crew members. "Would you like to press charges?" One officer asked her, notepad ready. She thought about it for a moment. The easy path would be to say yes, to let the legal system handle it. But she had seen too many similar incidents end with hollow apologies and empty promises of additional training. "Not at this time," she replied, much to everyone's surprise. "But I would like all these witnesses' statements documented." She had learned long ago that real change rarely comes from the expected paths. In the terminal, her phone was buzzing constantly. The videos were already spreading across social media. News outlets were calling. The airline's PR team was desperately trying to reach her. She ignored them all for the moment. Instead, she pulled out her laptop and began to research. The airline's stock price, their board composition, their hiring practices, their history of similar incidents. Every detail could be important for what she had in mind. A text message popped up from her assistant. "The tech conference organizers heard what happened. They want to know if you'll still give the keynote tomorrow." "Absolutely," she typed back. "But I'm going to need to make some changes to my speech." Her presentation about making tech more inclusive suddenly had a powerful new real-world example. By the time she reached her hotel, the story had gone viral. Hashtag first-class assault was trending. People were calling for boycotts. The airline's stock was already dropping in after-hours trading. But she wasn't interested in viral outrage or temporary stock dips. Opening her laptop, she began drafting emails to her financial advisors. "Time to look into some strategic investments," she wrote. The airline's CEO had already released a statement. We take these allegations very seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation. She smiled slightly at the corporate speak. They had no idea what was coming. Most people would have been traumatized, angry, seeking immediate revenge. But years of fighting for her place in the tech world had taught her something valuable. Sometimes the best response isn't the most obvious one. Sometimes real change requires a longer game. In her hotel room that night, she put her tech skills to good use. While social media was still erupting with outrage over the viral videos, she was diving deep into public records, financial reports, and employee reviews of the airline. What she found was eye-opening. Her incident wasn't just a one-off event. There were patterns. Dozens of complaints buried in civil rights reports, employee testimonies hidden in legal documents, and troubling stories from both passengers and staff. "Look at this," she told her financial advisor over a secure video call. "Their discrimination complaints have risen 300% in the last 3 years, but they've managed to keep it quiet." She scrolled through document after document, each one revealing another piece of the puzzle. Her keynote speech the next morning started differently than planned. Instead of beginning with tech innovation, she opened with what happened on the flight. The audience fell silent as she described the incident, not with anger, but with quiet determination. "Yesterday showed me that having power isn't enough," she told the packed conference hall. "What matters is how we use that power to create real change." The applause was deafening, but she wasn't there for applause. She was there to set her plan in motion. During the lunch break, she met with her team of financial analysts. "I don't want to just file a lawsuit," she explained. "I want to transform their entire corporate culture. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Her team worked around the clock, gathering data. Former employees started reaching out, sharing their stories. A pattern emerged. The airline's problems went deeper than a few biased employees. It was about systems, policies, and an ingrained corporate culture that needed complete reform. The airline's PR team kept calling, offering settlements, making promises. She let their messages go to voicemail. Instead, she focused on building relationships with other investors who shared her vision for corporate responsibility. "The problem isn't just about one flight crew," she explained to a group of potential allies. "It's about an entire industry that needs to change, and change happens from the inside." Her words resonated with others who had seen similar issues in their own experiences. While the media focused on the viral video, she was quietly meeting with industry experts, diversity consultants, and airline veterans. Each conversation added another piece to her growing strategy. She wasn't just planning revenge, she was planning a revolution. Her assistant brought more news. Other passengers from different flights were coming forward with similar stories. The airline's stock price was continuing to drop as more incidents came to light. But she knew that public outrage would fade. She needed something more permanent. Late one night, reviewing financial reports, she found what she was looking for. The airline was more vulnerable than it appeared. Their corporate structure had weaknesses that could be turned into opportunities. With the right strategy, real change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. She picked up her phone and called her investment team. "We're going to need to move faster than planned," she said. "How quickly can we start acquiring shares?" The answer made her smile. The airline thought they were dealing with a simple PR problem. They had no idea they were about to face something much bigger. As she looked out her hotel window at the city lights, she thought about that young girl on the plane who had called her brave. "Sometimes," she whispered to herself, "being brave means playing the long game." She turned back to her laptop and began drafting her most ambitious plan yet. The next few months would require patience, strategy, and perfect timing. But she had built her tech empire from nothing. She knew how to turn obstacles into opportunities. And this time, she wasn't just building a company, she was rebuilding an entire corporate culture. 3 months passed quietly. The viral video had faded from the headlines. The airline's PR team probably thought they'd weathered the storm. They couldn't have been more wrong. She worked from her office, watching the numbers on her screens. Her team had been buying shares steadily, carefully, staying just under the radar. Another 2% acquired, her financial advisor reported. She nodded, checking off another box in her plan. The airline's stock price had never fully recovered from the incident. Every time it started to rise, another story would mysteriously surface. More complaints, more videos, more testimonies from former employees. She hadn't leaked any of them. She didn't need to. The truth had a way of coming out once people started looking. They still don't know. Her assistant mentioned one morning, placing a coffee on her desk. The airline's board thinks these are just random investors buying up shares. She smiled, remembering how many times people had underestimated her in the tech world too. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of her allies, a pension fund manager who controlled a significant chunk of airline stock. "We're in. Just say when." More messages followed from other investors who believed in her vision. The pieces were falling into place. At night, she refined her plans for the airline. Not just surface-level diversity training, but real, structural changes. Better hiring practices. New complaint procedures. Complete policy overhauls. She'd learned from building her tech company that true change had to start at the foundation. The flight attendant who'd slapped her had been fired weeks ago. The pilot had been suspended. But that wasn't enough. The problem isn't just a few bad employees, she explained to her team. It's about changing the entire system that allowed this to happen. One morning, her stock tracker lit up. They'd done it. Through various investment vehicles and allied investors, they now controlled 51% of the airline's shares. She was officially the majority shareholder. The airline's executives still didn't know. Their next board meeting was scheduled for the following week. They were expecting a routine gathering, probably planning to discuss quarterly profits and fuel costs. They had no idea their entire world was about to change. She spent hours preparing her presentation. Not a word about revenge. Not a mention of that day on the plane. Instead, page after page of solid business proposals. Charts showing how diversity improved profits. Studies proving that inclusive companies performed better in the long run. The night before the board meeting, she couldn't sleep. Not from nerves. She'd faced too many boardrooms to be nervous anymore. No, she was excited. Real change was finally within reach. Her phone kept lighting up with supportive messages. The young girl from the plane had found her on social media. "Did you really buy the whole airline?" Well, not the whole airline, she thought, smiling. Just enough to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. The business news was buzzing with rumors. Someone was buying up airline stock. Someone had big plans. Someone was about to shake things up. But nobody knew who. Yet. She laid out her outfit for the next day. Not the casual clothes she'd worn on that fateful flight, but not a typical power suit either. Something in between. Something that said she belonged exactly where she was. Tomorrow, she would walk into that boardroom and show them what real leadership looked like. Tomorrow, she would turn a moment of humiliation into a movement for change. Tomorrow, she would remind everyone that success isn't just about making money. It's about making a difference. And somewhere, in another city, a flight attendant and pilot who'd let their prejudices control their actions would learn an important lesson. You never know who you're dealing with, so it's best to treat everyone with respect. The boardroom fell silent as she walked in. Their faces showed confusion, then recognition, then shock. The airline's CEO, who had signed off on that weak apology months ago, nearly dropped his coffee cup. "Good morning," she said calmly, taking her seat at the head of the table. "As a majority shareholder of this airline, I think it's time we had a serious conversation about the future." The silence deepened. Some board members started frantically flipping through their papers, looking for information about this unexpected development. She didn't waste time on dramatic reveals or accusations. Instead, she opened her laptop and began her presentation. Our current market value is down 23% from last quarter. Our customer satisfaction scores are at an all-time low. And our staff turnover rate is twice the industry average. Slide after slide, she laid out her vision. New training programs developed by diversity experts. Updated hiring practices to build a more inclusive workforce. A complete overhaul of customer complaint procedures. Better pay and support for flight crews to reduce stress and improve service. But this isn't just about fixing problems, she explained, her voice firm but encouraging. It's about becoming an industry leader. Studies show that diverse companies outperform their competitors by 35%. Inclusive businesses have higher customer loyalty and better employee retention. One by one, she watched the board members' expressions change from defensive to interested. When she showed them the projected profits from her proposed changes, even the most skeptical executives started nodding along. What happened to me on that flight was a symptom of deeper issues, she continued. Issues we're going to fix not because of bad publicity or legal pressure, but because it's good business, because it's the right thing to do. By the end of the meeting, the transformation had begun. The old board was restructured. New policies were put in place. Training programs were revamped. And most importantly, a clear message was sent. Discrimination had no place in this company. 3 months later, she stood in front of the airline's employees, announcing the changes. We're not just changing rules, she told them. We're changing our entire culture. Every employee, every passenger, deserves to feel respected and valued. The flight attendant who had been so hostile to her was gone, but not just fired, sent to a program to understand the impact of bias. The pilot had volunteered to lead one of the new training initiatives, turning his mistake into a teaching moment. A year passed. The airline's stock price had doubled. Customer complaints were down 60%. Employee satisfaction scores were at record highs. Other airlines started copying their diversity programs and training methods. That young girl who had called her brave reached out again, now dreaming of becoming a pilot herself. The airline's new scholarship program would help make that dream possible. She still flew first class on business trips, but now she noticed something different. The crew was more diverse. The service was more professional. The whole atmosphere had changed. One day, while checking the company's latest performance reports, she found a letter on her desk. It was from a flight attendant. Thank you for showing us that real leadership isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. She smiled, thinking back to that difficult day on the plane. Sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best opportunities for change. Sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't revenge, it's reform. The business world had expected her to sue the airline into bankruptcy. Instead, she had turned it into a model of corporate responsibility. She hadn't just changed one company, she had set a new standard for an entire industry. And somewhere out there, on thousands of flights every day, people of all backgrounds were being treated with the respect they deserved. That, she thought, was the sweetest revenge of all.